Hey everyone, how you doing? Today I thought I'd look at game number 44 in the Season 17 Superfinal between LCZero and Stockfish. This was played on the 15th of April this year, and in this game Leela was playing with the white pieces, Stockfish with black, and we get into a Scandi or Scandinavian. So e4 d5 was the opening that was picked in this game, and takes was played, queen takes, knight c3, the queen dropped back to d6, then there was d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, and a6 followed by g3. And now Stockfish, playing with the black pieces, played bishop g4, pinning the knights on f3. And in the reverse fixture, Stockfish actually played the move h3 here. And as we saw previously, bishop h5 was played, bishop g2, and then e6, and white got a really good game after g4. Bishop g6, then knight to e5, and knight c6. And in this position, white captured on c6 and doubled black's pawns. And as we saw in my previous video, Stockfish absolutely battered Leela in this game. There's no two questions about it. So it's interesting in this fixture to see what Leela would do. Instead of playing h3 like Stockfish did then, she played bishop to f4 in this game, hitting the queen, which went to e6 with a check. Leela drops her bishop back to block, and the queen comes to f5 to attack the knight. Leela defends the knight, and Stockfish plays e6. We do get an h3. There's a trade of bishops. The bishop's now hitting b7, and Stockfish just calmly plays c6 though, and Leela continues developing with queen e2. And Stockfish now plays knight b to d7. So okay, both sides are just basically developing their pieces sensibly here. It's a pretty even game so far. Leela now castles queenside. The bishop comes into b4 to attack the knight on c3. So Leela defends it to stop any doubled c-pawns, and Stockfish just castles kingside, and Leela puts their king onto b1 to get it to safety. And now we're into a very double-edged position because both sides have castled on opposite sides of the board, and Stockfish continues attacking with queen to a5. Leela plays a3, and there's a trade on c3. The queen drops back to c7, and Leela plays h4. So basically now, after the smoke has cleared somewhat, Leela actually has the two bishops, and you would argue that white's got a significant advantage with these two pieces on the board. If they can mobilise them quite well, white should be doing very well here. But first, Stockfish just play knight to d5, so attacking the bishop on c3. So Leela retreats it back to d2, a very sensible move. And now Stockfish hits in with b5, preparing to attack the king. But now Leela does a very AlphaZero move, plays h5. And I've seen this in a previous AlphaZero game where they basically launched these pawns up the board, and they had these raking bishops coming across this way on the board. And basically in this game AlphaZero sacks a load of pawns. This doesn't happen in this game, but it's quite a similar theme. For instance, queen b6 is played, and Leela just continues with h6. A very interesting move, because if black now tries to snap up this d4 pawn, white gets a really good position after h takes g7. If king takes g7, then just bishop h6 check will win the queen. And if queen takes g7, then white can just play rook h5, preparing to go rook to g5. If f6, then just queen takes e6, comes crashing in. Queen f7, queen takes c6. White's got an amazing position here. So going back after queen takes d4, h takes g7, it is possible for black to move their rook just away. But white can now follow in with bishop to e4, and after knight to f6, bishop to d3. The point is now white's preparing to play rook h4 and double their rooks on this h-file, and there's very little that black can do to stop it, and Stockfish rates this position as winning for white. Alright, so in the game, instead of taking, which I think is a good option, Stockfish has played g6 instead, and now Leela just played king a1 to get off the b file and no longer be eyed up by black's queen. Rook fb8 was played, and then queen drops back to d8, and Leela drops her bishop back to c1, and now Stockfish plays a5, preparing moves like b4 and opening up the king side against white. So Leela now plays a very interesting move to stop this b4 pawn moving up. He plays c4, attacking the knight on d5, and now black just takes the c pawn off. Makes a lot of sense because it opens up the b file for the rook. So Leela recaptures with the queen, and now queen f6 was played, attacking the bishop on f3. Leela moves their bishop to e4, and we'll probably drop it back to b1. As I say, this is a similar theme to the AlphaZero game with the two bishops on the back rank. If black now takes on f2, then white can play a nice move rook f1. If black goes pawn grabbing, then white can take a pawn as well, attacking the knight, and if knight to f6, bishop takes d5 can be played, knight takes, and white's got a nice move here, just rook takes f7, king takes f7, and queen to d7, with mating ideas against his king. So if it moves backwards here, the queen's coming in to g7, so it's forced up the board, and then white can play rook f1, and just pester this king now after knight to f4, queen g7, king g5, queen e5. The king moves further up the board and white just takes back a piece, and white's just in a totally one position here after queen takes e6. They're either going to win the queen or checkmate the black king. Just look how far the black king's moved up in that position. So in the game, instead of pawn grabbing, Stockfish played rook c8 instead to defend the c6 pawn. Leela defended her pawn on f2, knight went into b6, and Leela just follows up with their plan of playing g4, preparing moves like g5 and getting a great pawn chain. Stockfish puts their other rook onto the b file, rook e1 is played, the knight drops back to d7, Leela now plays rook f1, queen e7, now f4, and after rook e8, queen f3 and knight to f6, finally Leela just drop her bishop back to b1, and we see this is very similar to the AlphaZero game, with these two raking bishops just dominating the position. I say this now though because a move later she does actually move them again, but because after a4 she moves it back to a2. Stockfish moves their king to h8, Leela goes rook f2, the rook goes to c8, rook c2 and then queen to d7, bishop d2 and then king goes back to g8 and now g5 from white. And all of a sudden after knight to h5, white's got an amazing pawn chain here. f4, g5 and h6, and it's really squashing black's position. Apologies if I'm going quite fast, but it's just that there's a lot of moves in this game and I want to get everything covered. Rook c4 was played by Leela, attacking a4, queen a7 to defend, Leela doubles rooks, attacks c6, and now rook b8 is played. It is possible actually here for white to take the c6 pawn off. After queen takes d4 it's basically a pawn trade. The rook has to go back to c2 to defend b2. And after knight takes f4 though, white can play rook f1. And after e5, bishop b4, white's given as better here. After queen d8, rook d2 for instance, queen c8. I think the two bishops are very telling in this variation. I mean, they always say a knight on the rim is very dim, and that knight is quite sad in this position. I can see why Leela didn't take a pawn on c6 though. Instead she just strengthened her position with queen to f2, defending d4. Knight e7 was played, the bishop dropped back to b1, the queen went to b7, and now the bishop blocks the b file with bishop to b4. Queen c7 is played, bishop d2, rook c8, bishop e4. So there's a lot of shuffling here, but after queen d7, Leela wins a pawn. I'm not sure why black didn't just opt to defend that. Maybe it's undefendable because I guess bishop takes c6 maybe on the cards here. But anyway, queen d7 was played and Leela just took the free pawn on a4. So white's now a whole pawn up. Knight d5 was played and Leela thought this was a great time to trade pieces. Takes was played, queen takes, and now just queen to e3, defending everything. Queen d7, Leela doubles rooks again. The rook comes into b5. And with rook c5, Stockfish declines a trade, the queen e5 is played, threatening queen g7 ideas, basically making this knight stay on h5 for as long as possible. Rook a8 was played, the rook went to c4 for Leela, rook a6 to defend this c6 pawn, and now just rook b4, so slowly white's just encroaching on black's position and just dominating, and maybe even threatening back rank chances here with rook to b8. So this forces the rook back to a8. King b1 is played to keep the king very safe. Rook d8, and now Leela just plays a4. And after rook f8, she just charges this pawn up the board with a5. It's very well protected on this square. Stockfish plays f6, trying to break up this immense pawn chain. And Leela just takes on f6. The knight takes, and the rook just goes to c4, threatening to take on c6. And it looks quite undefendable at the moment. So knight g4 was played. Queen e4, again attacking c6. It's basically a trade of pawns because Stockfish takes on h6. Rook takes c6 is now played. and it looks as though the e6 pawn may be lost as well. Rook e8 is perfectly possible here, and if white just defends a5, then knight to f7. I think white still has the best position after rook c7, queen d8 and just bishop to c3. I think we'd all take white here. In the game though, Stockfish moved their knight to f5, allowing Leela to take on e6, so takes was played, takes. The rook comes to d8 to attack the d4 pawn, but the bishop is just in time to protect everything. So basically in this endgame now, white's just a whole pawn up, and we'll see how it finishes. So king f7 was played, the rook drops back to e1, and now Leela just comes charging up the board with her pawns. The knight is not as powerful as white's bishop in this position. They play f5, knight takes f5, and the king just comes up the board, and eventually these pawns will just become unstoppable. And basically in this endgame, Stockfish doesn't do a whole lot to stop it. So in this position, rook takes h5 has just been played, winning another pawn for white. Rook takes d4 can't really be played because then bishop to c3 can be played, which will pin the rook against the king. Rook b8 was played instead. Rook comes to g5, attacking g6, king f7, rook f1, and a few more moves are played. And eventually, white just comes up the board with their pawns, so attacks g5, the king defends, and now white gets in behind. So rook c7 to attack the bishop, which drops back to b2. I mean, black could take on d4 here if they wish, but it looks as though the a and b pawns are too strong. Knight e7, rook comes to c1, offering a trade. Black says no, no thanks, not yet. Rook e1, king g7, and Leela just comes backwards. So yeah, there's a lot of computer shuffling here, but Leela's just trying to find the optimal position to win. So they attack g5 again with this bishop, rook f5, and finally Leela just takes on g5. Rook takes g5, rook takes, and bishop takes. If king takes g5, white just wins with b5. If knight c8, there's king b4. And if b6 in this position, rook a8, b7, rook b8 and a6. Black can try this, knight d6, but white's got the sneaky rook e5. Point being, if knight takes b7, just rook b5 wins the rook on b8. So the game finished off with knight to d5 here, rook e5 to protect the bishop. There was a check, but after some more moves on both sides, eventually this knight sort of gets trapped offside on the other side of the board for a while, and eventually the king just comes up. So bishop g3 was a nice move, rook c8 check, king b5, allowing knight d5, but it's too little too late here. The king is so far up the board now. Bishop e1 attacking the knight, it drops back to b1, rook c7, rook takes d4, rook c1 attacking the knight again, and Stockfish just allows white to take this off, and a few more moves later, this is just a nice finish with black resigning here because the pawns are just so far up the board. So by no means was this a pretty game, and I'll be honest, it was a horrible game to analyse as well because I thought it was quite dull. It wasn't as interesting as the previous reverse fixture, but it's a testament to any champion to win ugly, and many great teams and players have managed to do this throughout their lives, and that's the trick to becoming great. Just got to win ugly sometimes. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this game. If you did, please do support the channel by dropping a like, comment or subscribing. It really helps out. And I'll try and cover the rest of these Superfinal games very soon. So see you next time.